My brother wed my unfaithful ex, she got pregnant, then insisted I forgive and move on. At one point in my life, I believed people could change. I figured if criminals can turn their lives around, maybe cheaters can too. But I do not believe that anymore. You can put a thief in a suit, give him a fresh start, and maybe he'll make something of himself. But a cheater? A cheater is always a cheater. My brother learned this the hard way. He spat in my face, told me I was jealous, and completely ignored me when I warned him about her. That's what really stung your own flesh and blood refusing to believe you. And now he's sitting there, staring at the undeniable proof that she did to him exactly what she did to me. You probably want the full story, so here it is. Her name is Jessica, and when I met her, she was all charm, big smiles, and the kind of flirty attitude that makes a guy feel like he's the only man on the planet. She was gorgeous, the kind of woman other guys envied. I was a scrawny, awkward kid in high school, so having a girl like her made me feel like I had finally won. I thought, yeah, I made it. I wasted a ton of money trying to impress her, bought a flashy car, took her to the best restaurants, made sure everyone knew she was mine. I was blind. From the start, Jessica was controlling. She went through my phone like she was the FBI. If a female coworker so much as texted me about work, she lost her mind. She made me cut ties with every woman I knew. She had this obsession with loyalty always, talking about how she had been betrayed before and could not handle being cheated on. I bent over backward to prove I was faithful. I even introduced her to my family to make her feel secure. When my best friend Michael saw her, he pulled me aside and told me to run. He had met girls like her before. He could see what I could not. That woman is bad news, he told me, but I refused to listen. I thought he was jealous. Eventually, I introduced Jessica to my parents and my older brother, Brian. He's 3 years older than me, but he's always been reckless, always the guy who never took life too seriously. I figured bringing Jessica on a family trip would be a good way for her to bond with them. We went to the beach, just a relaxing weekend together. That was my first mistake. We had barely been there a few hours when she accused me of checking out some girl in a bikini. I was not. I didn't even know what girl she was talking about. She lost it, screaming at me right there on the beach. Then, she slapped me across the face and stormed off. I was humiliated. I let her go cool off, but after a while, I started worrying and went to look for her. I searched everywhere up and down the beach, in town, near the shops. Nothing. I figured maybe she had gone back to the house. And that's where I found her. She was inside, not alone. Jessica and Brian, half naked, all over each other. I lost it. Everything inside me just snapped. Jessica had the audacity to blame me. She said it was my fault, that if I hadn't disrespected her by looking at other women, she never would have had to do it. I had not even looked at anyone, but that did not matter to her. Brian, on the other hand, acted like it was no big deal. He shrugged and said, "I did you a favor, man. She is not your type anyway." I left. I walked out and never looked back. Later, I found out that Jessica had been running around with other guys the whole time we were together. She went on fancy dates with men who bought her expensive gifts, and I was just one of many. I tried to warn Brian. I told him he was making a mistake. He called me bitter. He told me I needed to move on. A few months passed, and I got an invitation to their wedding. That was when it really hit me Brian was actually going through with it. He was going to marry this woman, the woman who had cheated on me with him. He barely even knew her, but he was convinced she was the one. A gold digger, a liar, a woman who had already proved she had no loyalty to anyone. I knew if I did nothing, he would regret it for the rest of his life. I gathered everything I could. Messages, photos, proof that Jessica had been running around with other men even while she was engaged to him. I confronted Brian. I showed him everything. And do you know what he said? She already told me all this. She was just finding herself. She had to explore to figure out what she really wanted. And she chose me. She chose him. And he believed her. So I did not go to the wedding. I refused. That caused a massive fight between us, and for years, we barely spoke. Then, out of nowhere, he reached out. Brian said Jessica was pregnant and that it was time to put everything behind us. My mother begged me to hear him out, so I agreed to meet them. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. Maybe she really had changed. She had not. She gave birth. And when I saw the baby, I knew something was off. The kid looked nothing like Brian. Not even close. He saw it too. The doubt was all over his face. And soon enough, he got the paternity test. The truth hit him like a freight train. It was not his child. Jessica had cheated on him too, just like I told him she would. Jessica made Brian throw the kind of wedding you only see in movies: huge, extravagant, and dripping with luxury. The whole thing must have cost a fortune, and the worst part? A big chunk of it came from my dad's bank account. She milked him dry, making sure no expense was spared. But that was not even the most outrageous part. Jessica had the audacity to invite a long list of men she had history with. Almost a quarter of the guests had been with her at some point. Can you imagine standing at the altar saying, "I do," while half the men in the crowd are thinking, "Yeah, I have been there too." It was disgusting. The rest of the guests were just as questionable her bizarre friends. Some distant relatives of mine who had no idea what was going on, and a whole bunch of people who had no business being there. My family was split over the wedding. My mom just wanted Brian to be happy, but my dad saw right through Jessica. He could not stand her. He refused to play along, made it clear he did not approve, but Brian did not care. Her own family? Nowhere to be found. They had completely cut ties with her. Makes you wonder what kind of person she really is when even her own blood refuses to show up for her big day. I was invited, of course, but there was no way in hell I was going. Brian did not take that well. He called me over and over, practically begging me to come. He acted like it was some kind of betrayal, like I was ruining his big day. I told him straight I was not going to my ex's wedding. That is when he lost it. He called me jealous. He said I could not stand to see him happy. That was the last conversation we had for 5 long years. Then one day, out of the blue, my mom called. She said Brian wanted to talk. I told her if he wanted to make things right, he needed to call me himself. No middlemen, no running to mom. He had to be a man and face me. She said she would tell him, but she begged me to give him a chance. I was not thrilled about it, but I told her I would try. A couple of days later, Brian finally called. I will never forget his tone smug, like he had won something. He told me Jessica was pregnant and that after 5 years, they were still going strong. He wanted to rub it in my face, prove me wrong, show me that she had been faithful after all. Then, like nothing had ever happened, he told me I needed to put the past behind us and be a good brother again for the sake of the baby. I went to see them. On the surface, they seemed like a happy, normal couple. Brian took every opportunity to remind me that I was still single, telling me I needed to get out there. Then he did something that made my blood boil. He thanked me. He actually thanked me for introducing him to Jessica, like I had done him some huge favor, like I had handed him the perfect wife and a picture-perfect life. I left their house fuming. I knew something was not right. I had to prove it. So I started digging. It did not take long before I found exactly what I was looking for. Jessica had not changed. Not one bit. She had been sneaking around behind Brian's back for years, checking into hotels with different men. And I had the proof. Screenshots, receipts, messages of it. One guy in particular, a man named David, had the final piece of the puzzle. He was furious when he found out Jessica was married. He had no idea. He sent me screenshots of her texting multiple men, using them for expensive gifts and nights out while Brian was working. I had all the evidence I needed, and then something unexpected happened. Jessica called me, asking me to come over. She said it was urgent. She was home alone, heavily pregnant, and I did not want to leave her stranded, so I went. She greeted me at the door, calm as ever. Then she hit me with the real reason she had called. She knew I had been snooping around. She knew I had dirt on her, and she had an offer. "If you keep quiet," she said, "I will sleep with you." She actually thought I would take that deal. I turned around and walked right out of there. But Jessica was not done. She flipped the whole thing around, ran straight to Brian, and told him I had been the one trying to sleep with her. She painted herself as the victim, claimed I had blackmailed her, said I threatened to expose her unless she slept with me. Brian was furious. I told him the truth. She had been the one to call me over. She had been the one to make the offer. But Brian would not hear it. I tried to show him the proof. He refused to look at it. I told my mom and dad everything, hoping they could talk some sense into him. That only made things worse. Now my whole family knew what Jessica had been up to, and my mom was heartbroken. She did not want to see Brian stuck in a miserable marriage, especially now that they had a child on the way. My dad, on the other hand, had no sympathy. He had seen this coming from a mile away. Brian still refused to believe it. My mom tried to reason with him, but he was too far gone. He thought I had manipulated her, that I had somehow convinced her that Jessica was cheating. He was angry. At me. not at Jessica. I stopped trying. There was no point arguing with someone who refused to see the truth. So I stepped back. I let him figure it out on his own. And sure enough, he did. Because the moment that baby was born, everything changed. Brian convinced himself that I had poisoned our mom's mind, that I had tricked her into thinking Jessica was cheating with fake proof. He got so mad at her that she eventually gave up. Just to keep the peace, she pretended to believe that Jessica was loyal, even though deep down, I knew she did not buy it for a second. At that point, I washed my hands of it. I distanced myself from Brian and his mess of a marriage because there was no point in arguing with someone who did not want to see the truth. And to make matters worse, he was already pissed at me for trying to seduce his wife. Then, a couple of months later, I got a call from him out of the blue. Jessica was in labor. My parents were stuck in another state, their flights canceled due to bad weather, and Brian was freaking out. He did not know what to do. Neither did I. But I was there for him anyway. It was a long, grueling birth, but in the end, Jessica had a baby boy. For a moment, I actually felt happy for them. Maybe, just maybe, they could start fresh. Then I saw the baby. Something was off. I could not put my finger on it at first, but the more I looked, the more it nagged at me. The baby had features that neither Jessica nor Brian had. And the eyes? They looked nothing like Brian's. I did not want to jump to conclusions, so I told myself, it is just a baby. Babies look weird sometimes. But something deep down kept screaming at Meth this child was not my brother's. I stayed with them for a few days, and every time I looked at the baby, the doubt grew stronger. Then, one night, it just hit me. I had been right all along. I laughed to myself because at that moment, I knew I had won. Jessica had done it again. And Brian knew it too. I could see it in his face. He had been acting strange, barely interacting with the baby. He had no real connection to the child, no bond at all. A couple days later, he came to my place and finally said it out loud. I do not think the baby is mine. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. He admitted that they had always been careful, always used protection, but Jessica had shrugged it off, saying it must have failed. Now, he was not so sure. That was all I needed to hear. I laid everything out for Heimvery piece of evidence I had collected over the years. The messages, the hotel bookings, the men she had been with, the proof that she had been cheating on him since day one. He broke down. For the first time in years, Brian finally saw the truth. He sobbed like I had never seen him sob before. Meanwhile, Jessica was blowing up his phone, calling over and over. She was home alone with the baby and could not handle it. She needed him. I told him he had to take a paternity test. Make it official. So he did. And the results were exactly what we both knew they would be. He was not the father. When he confronted Jessica, she lost her mind. She tried every trick in the book, crying, yelling, flipping the blame on him for doubting her in the first place. She called him a terrible husband, a terrible father. Then she had the biggest meltdown I had ever seen, screaming, throwing things, waking the baby up with her tantrum. Brian packed his bags that night and left. He moved back into our parents' house, taking the baby with him because, at this point, he did not trust Jessica to care for him properly. And here's the weirdest part, despite everything, despite knowing the kid was not his, I could tell he was starting to get attached. And so were our parents. But he still sent Jessica divorce papers. And she was not ready to let go. At first, she flat out denied everything. She even accused Brian of faking the DNA results. Then, when she could not keep the lie going any longer, she tried a new story. She claimed the baby was conceived through in vitro fertilization and that they had used a sperm donor. Of course, she could not prove a damn thing. So the court granted the divorce on grounds of adultery. The baby was legally not Brian's, which meant he had no rights to custody. That did not stop Jessica from demanding child support and spousal maintenance. But the court shut that down too. Noah was not the father. He did not owe her a single dime. That is when she turned her anger on me. She blamed me for everything. She kept calling me, leaving messages, ranting about how I had ruined her life. Then she went crawling back to Brian, begging him to take her in. She had nowhere to go. Surprisingly, my parents offered to help her out for a while, just until she could get back on her feet. I did not agree with it, but what could I do? My parents have always been good-hearted people. I still cannot wrap my head around how Brian let himself get played like that. I know I should let it go, but part of me feels like he deserved every bit of it. I told him, I warned him. I did everything I could to stop him from ruining his own life. And instead of listening to me, he believed that I had tried to sleep with his wife. After everything, I am still debating whether I should even keep talking to him. The only reason I stayed in touch for so long was to prove I was right. And now that I have, I feel satisfied. Like my job is done. I even find it funny sometimes. I wanted to rub it in his face, to remind him every chance I got, to watch his expression turn pale as the truth settled in. Call me petty, but after everything he put me through, I felt like I had earned that satisfaction. Some of you might say I am a terrible person for thinking this way, but I do not care. My brother was no saint either. Now, I am stuck between cutting ties with him completely or just keeping my distance while pretending everything is fine. I have no idea what to do. Anyway, let me give you all an update on the mess that is my brother's life. Yeah, you heard that right. The woman who cheated on me with my own brother, the same woman who swore she had changed, went ahead and got pregnant by another man. And, as expected, my brother finally woke up and divorced her. Now, here is the kicker: Jessica had nowhere to go. And who stepped in to save her? My parents. They let her stay in one of their apartments, rent-free, because of the baby. They did not want to see a child on the streets, and, well, Jessica knew exactly how to play that angle. I knew she would be fine no matter what. She had always found a way to survive using people, charming them, making them believe she was helpless. She would have found another guy to take her in, no doubt about it. But my parents? They are good people, too good. After the divorce, her lawyer told her she needed to find the real father so he could start paying child support. The problem? She had no idea who it was. That did not stop her from acting entitled. She started dumping the baby on my mom every morning so she could go look for work. But she would come home late at night, sometimes not at all. My mom, being the kind-hearted person she is, turned into a full-time babysitter. My dad, though, he had enough of it. He told Jessica to stop leaving the baby with them. He made it clear that they were not going to raise her kid for her. And that is when the real Jessica came out. She threw a fit. She screamed about how selfish they were, how they were cruel and heartless for refusing to help her. She called them terrible people. And my mom, she caved. She kept taking care of the baby. My dad was furious, and so was I. Brian wanted nothing to do with any of it, but I was not going to sit back and let her use my family. I took matters into my own hands. I found her a job, or at least I tried. Turns out, while she was supposed to be looking for work, she had been shacking up with some new boyfriend, a guy who worked from home and did not want to deal with a crying baby. So, guess what? He told her to drop the kid off at my parents' place so they could have their alone time. When I found out, I told my parents everything. That was the final straw. They cut her off. They gave her 1 week to move out and figure out her own life. And of course, the boyfriend dumped her the second she asked him to actually commit. Now homeless, she moved in with one of her friends. But since I had already gone through all the trouble of finding her a job, I made sure she took it. A cleaning job at a daycare. It was perfect. The daycare would look after the baby while she worked. She took it because she was desperate. And honestly, watching her go from living off other people to scrubbing floors was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. Jessica thought she could get away with everything. Thought she could cheat, lie, and manipulate forever. Well, life had other plans, and I could not stop laughing. She really thought she could have another man's child and nobody would notice. She brought this on herself. Now, I will admit I had mixed feelings. She was a terrible person, no doubt. But the baby did not deserve any of this. I hated Jessica, but I felt bad for her kid. I hoped, for the baby's sake, that she would finally get her act together. But knowing her, I was not holding my breath. That is all for now. Thanks for sticking around and following the madness. And thanks for all the comments. It is weirdly comforting knowing I am not the only one who thinks she got what she deserved. After reading through what you all had to say, I decided not to cut my brother off completely. But things will never go back to how they were. Jessica did not just ruin his life, she ruined our relationship too. Brian barely speaks to any of us anymore. And honestly, I do not know if I should reach out or just let him disappear. Let me know what you think. Alright, another update because apparently the drama never ends. I finally reached out to my brother, and believe it or not, I am glad I did. For the first time, he admitted how wrong he had been. He told me he felt ashamed for not believing me, that the divorce, everything that happened, had completely broken him. And you know what? I am actually relieved I did not cut him off. It was not easy though. I was still mad. I had to force myself to put my anger aside and listen to him. Because here is the thing, trusting your partner is one thing. Blindly believing them and turning your back on your entire family, that is another. At this point, I feel like I am the older brother. Eventually, I told him the truth. I told him how much anger I had held on to, how much I resented him for being the guy my girlfriend cheated with. And finally, he apologized. He admitted he had been an idiot. He realized he never should have trusted Jessica over his own blood. He also apologized for rubbing his perfect marriage in my face all those years. I had forgotten just how many times he had mocked me for being single. Looking back, he had been awful to me for a long time. It was not just about Jessica. Brian had always been self-centered, always convinced he was smarter than everyone else. Marrying Jessica was just his biggest mistake. And then there is Jessica herself. For a while, I thought she was doing fine. Turns out, she was not even good at cleaning. So what did she do? She slept with the manager. That is right. She hooked up with a 47-year-old daycare manager and got herself promoted to a helper. Except she was terrible at that too. She could not even take care of her own baby, let alone other people's kids. The staff complained. The parents complained. And eventually they had no choice but to fire her. The manager dumped her too. And now, she was jobless again. Desperate, she finally tracked down the baby's real father. His name was Kyle. Rich, middle-aged. And, surprise, surprise, a cheater just like Jessica. The man was already married. His wife Rita was a wonderful woman. And when she found out what he had done, well, let us just say things got interesting. Jessica showed up at Kyle's doorstep without warning, acting like she had the upper hand. She probably thought she could just drop a baby in his lap and force him to take responsibility. But Kyle wanted nothing to do with her or the child. He denied everything, told her to get lost. Jessica, being Jessica, did not take no for an answer. She called the police, dragged him into legal trouble, and forced him into a paternity test. And of course, the results came back exactly as expected. Kyle was the father. His wife Rita was devastated. She had always wanted children but could not conceive. So instead of walking away, she decided they should fight for custody. They took Jessica to court, hoping to take the child from her. But Kyle? He was not interested in raising the baby. He was just going through the motions for his wife's sake. And that is why they lost the case. Jessica, on the other hand, did not care about the baby, she cared about the paycheck. She wanted child support. And she got it. Kyle was ordered to pay her a huge sum every month. With that money coming in, Jessica did what she did best. She found another guy to take care of her while the daycare watched her kid. She was worse than I ever imagined. And she was not going to stay young and attractive forever. One day, that well would dry up. And then what? No sane man would marry her now, not with the reputation she had built for herself. She was jumping from man to man, using them for what she needed, and sooner or later, it was going to catch up to her. The only person I truly felt bad for was the baby. That kid did not ask for any of this. I kept hoping Jessica would wake up, change her ways, and at least try to be a decent mother. But deep down, I knew that was not going to happen. For now, she had money. She had comfort. But tough times were coming. And my brother and I, we just sat back and watched the whole thing unfold. This town is small, and news spreads fast. Everyone knew what kind of person Jessica was now. No decent man wanted anything to do with her. She surrounded herself with all the wrong people, and I could only hope it would not destroy the child in the process. Hello again, folks. I know I said my last update was the end of it, but somehow things keep getting worse. Jessica hit rock bottom. And I mean rock bottom. I always knew she would end up in bad company, but even I was shocked by how low she had fallen. The men she was hanging around were not just losers, they were criminals. Drug dealers. Dangerous people. I have no problem with women living their lives however they want, but Jessica had crossed into a whole new level of reckless. And then, one night, she overdosed. She was in some rundown apartment with one of her latest boyfriends when it happened. She lay there, unconscious, for nearly 20 hours. And her baby? Left completely alone. Somehow, the kid managed to open the front door and wander out into the street. A neighbor saw him dirty, crying, barely able to walk straight. He was inches away from getting hit by a car. The neighbor brought him back to the apartment and found Jessica passed out, completely unresponsive. The authorities were called. Jessica was taken to the hospital. The child was placed in protective custody. And here is the worst part: when they examined the kid, they found out he had been exposed to extremely high amounts of drugs and smoke. At his age, that was incredibly dangerous. My brother Brian felt terrible. Despite everything, he still had a soft spot for the kid. So we did what we could to check in on him. After a full evaluation, Kyletha the baby's actual father was contacted, and he was awarded custody. But it was not Kyle who really took care of the baby. It was Rita. She was a school teacher, a kind, loving woman. And even though the child was not hers, she took him in like he was. She decided to raise him as her own, and then, to no one's surprise, she filed for divorce. She had all the proof she needed. Kyle had betrayed her. He had a child with another woman. She took him to court and walked away with a massive alimony payout. I will say this: thank God Rita got out of that marriage. She deserved better. And, even more importantly, the baby deserved better. Not only did she divorce Kyle, but she legally adopted the child. She is raising him as her own now, as a single mom. And honestly, I think she is doing an amazing job. My mom, who had grown attached to the baby, was relieved. Rita even let her visit. But when it came to Jessica, nobody wanted anything to do with her, and I do not blame them. She had burned every bridge she ever had. She was in the hospital for weeks after the overdose. She could have died that night. If she had taken just a little bit more, or if no one had found her in time, she would not have made it. And the baby? He was severely malnourished. He had been hungry for so long, his little body was weak. His diaper had not been changed in what must have been an entire day. If he had not managed to open that door and get out, he could have died too. Jessica was sentenced to 6 months in rehab. She barely avoided jail time, but only because she paid a hefty fine. At this point, I do not even know what to say. I always knew she was bad news, but I never imagined it would get this bad.